Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you, Stanislavas, for such a wonderful introduction, and it's so good to be back in the debating circle, at least for a brief moment. So a brief contextualization for my workshop is that it's constructed in a very selfish manner, meaning I will cover the topics that I'm myself very much interested in, currently reading about or doing research for. But of course, I have it in mind that this is supposed to be useful for you all in some capacity, in somehow applicable to your debating practice. So I will try to tie it back to debating as much as possible. But I think my ultimate goal for this workshop is just to provide to you some sort of framework and textual basis for you to debate nationalism and national identity. Because I remember when I was a debater, I would always struggle to make any argument for, I don't know, starting with patriotism, nationalism, following back to the nation state. It was usually difficult to make these coherent arguments in support or kind of a more nuanced arguments about these phenomenon, because I think they just have a lot of bad rep as of looking into the, I don't know, the 20th century history. We see that these concepts got tied up a lot with very problematic and traumatic history. And of course, we're still seeing movements, especially on the political right, who are holding questionable beliefs and cloaking them in a sense of protection of national identity, nationalism, nation state. So I think it gets very complicated very easily to make different kinds of arguments and kind of shed light on why we need national identity, or why does it still exist, and what could be the practical basis for that. And the way I'm trying to structure this workshop is to kind of bring it down from this metaphysical pedestal of national identity, collective memory, to something a bit more tangible, that being this foreign policy lens, and how national identity and nationalism gets translated into actual policy decisions. So this was a lengthy introduction and justification for the topic. Yeah, so the agenda for today, well, it's a bit ambitious. We will see how much or how in depth we can cover all of these points. But I really hope we can have some time for discussion or questions at the end. So first, I would like to talk for us to talk about what is national identity, what is this concept, to kind of provide you this theoretical framework. And moving on, like, why do we need national identity? Why hasn't it become obsolete, especially in this, I don't know, globalized, modernized world where people seem to be much more out there in the world, much more global in all meanings of that word. Then I will cover the processes or kind of the building stones of national identity and how is it actually formed. Then I will make this connection between national identity and foreign policy, and why we can synergize these two concepts and see how there is some sort of multi-directional relationship between them. And then I will try to cover two case studies. And I will not be making a very coherent, full-fledged argument about these case studies, but it's just stemming from my recent readings and my recent observations. So I thought it would be interesting to share. And then, as I said, I hope we can have some time for questions and discussion. Okay, so what is oh wow, I misspelled the title. What is national identity, and how is what is this concept? So I think the most important thing for us to understand here is nationalism and national identity, as we understand it now, is a relatively no, actually, in the grand scheme of things, a very recent concept. And the father of nationalism is considered to be this German guy, Herder, who in 18th century was, and he is considered to be the first ethnographers, or I guess that's a big label, but he's the one who did it very systematically. An ethnographer is, of course, a person who goes into the communities, observes them, sees how they interact, sees what's their culture is like, and tries to document and kind of classify them and kind of make observations. It's like a scientific research method. So what Herder did was in 18th century, he started traveling around and looking into different communities, seeing how they interact with each other, what kind of songs they sing, what kind of stories they tell, what language are they speaking, what dialect. So he was like traveling around in the periphery of Germany. And he was the one, and then he would, of course, take notes, get back home, and see, like, try to cluster this information and try to make some scientific observations. And of course, he came up with this revolutionary idea that people are different. And in one village, they have one stories. If you move 100 kilometers away, people already have different culture and different ways of telling, singing songs and interacting with each other, and have maybe slightly different communal norms. So he basically made an argument that people are different and people have these what he called Volkgeist. So this kind of Geist, I think, is a German word that's better translated into a vibe. So that people have different vibes, and that there is something tying them together. So that was how nationalism started, and of course, Herder's argument was that all the communities are beautiful and they're just unique in their different ways. And of course, unfortunately, in the 20th century, with the rise of fascism and Hitler in Germany, he was grossly his argument was grossly misrepresented, and the Nazis used it as to kind of base their idea that their race or their people are better and superior. But Herder inherently was just peace loving, and embracing all these communal differences that he observed. And then I think the other very foundational work for nationalism and national identity studies was published in, I think, late 90s. Is this book of Benedict Anderson called Imagine Communities. And if you're interested in this topic and you think it's something that you would like to read more about, I think this book is absolutely brilliant, and you will just do yourself a favor, because I remember when I came to college, this was one of the first books I had to read. So it's a very it's a prolific read, and it's still very much relevant in academia today. And Anderson's argument was basically traces back how the nations are imagined, and how this myth of one group, one culture, and something that's uniting us is created, and how is later instrumentalized in for building nation states and for holding this nation state cohesion. And I think one of the great arguments of how these communities are constructed for him was, for example, reading a morning newspaper. And of course, I think this was more relevant than, I don't know, morning newspapers, especially the local ones. So, for example, I don't know, if you were in Molėtai, you were all reading one Molėtai news, whatever. So basically, what does it mean then every day, almost every single person of a community picks up the same newspaper and reads the same kind of information and is on the same page about what is happening in the community, how are people thinking about things, what is going on. We kind of start sharing this same mental space. So they're all operating in the same medium. And for Benedict Anderson, this was just a small anecdote how people can be brought together into these imagined communities through the means that are very much tangible. So, moving away from this very theoretical academic lineage of nationalism and national identity, I like to think of national identity as a frame of reference. So there is national identity could be considered as something that some sort of agreement between the people living in the community on their basic values, priorities, and collective memories. So what kind of moments in history we all cherish, what kind of trajectory on or priorities we have as a nation. So of course, and this consensus is not will never probably be uniform. So there are still deviations. But I think on at least on the elite level, there has to be an agreement, and then this agreement starts trickling down to individuals. And then, so I like to think of this framework as society individual. So how individual beliefs get normalized or standardized, and hence we have a formation of a society. But then, of course, national identity is inherently related to this concept of the other. So how I like to think about national identities, like you defining yourself against others, right? So we are Lithuanians because we are not Poles or Russians or Belarusians, and why are we different? So we have to make an argument. How do you differ from others around you to kind of establish your own identity? So in this framework, I think about this as creating this connection between society and the world. So what is your place in the world? How do you differ from others? And of course, national identity is also based on these national myths and symbols that are of course imagined, as Anderson would say, but they provide some sort of basis or some sort of narrative for people to kind of rally around. Um, then I think it's very important to discuss, why do we need national identity? Why it hasn't become obsolete in all these years? And I think, and of course, there are many arguments made that are tied to political realities and the rise of the nation state. Um, Basically, claiming that, well, countries need to establish the historical right, or moral right for the existence of their state, or for some sort of autonomy within the greater political formation. And that's why they need to establish some sort of story about themselves, kind of saying that we were always here, we were always the people, united by language, the stories we told to each other, some sort of myths. That's why we need some political representation. And this is especially important for what is called ahistorical nations. So nations that do not have a very clear-cut lineage of historical presence or some sort of political formation. As you probably know, Eastern Europe is filled with so-called ahistorical nations that at some points in history were completely removed from the map, and then they reemerged. And then, of course, you have to make an argument. Why do you need to? Why do you have to be allowed to create your own state? But these are very intuitive political arguments that existed there for a very long time. But what I think is very helpful is to kind of think about a slightly more philosophical framework for national identity. I think the concept that is very useful here is Kierkegaard's notion of angst, or anxiety and dread. And basically, what Kierkegaard said was, well, people are free, and hence we have so many choices. Every day we encounter choices, and we are forced to pick and choose, and there is such a great degree of uncertainty that people just inherently feel dread. They feel anxious, and I think this is well, as a subjective human being, I think this is more or less true. I think when you're just overwhelmed with all the decisions that you have to make and everything is so uncertain, it kind of has a toll on the human psychic. And but of course, Kierkegaard's concept of this dread over the endless possibilities and the endless freedom that we have is not new. Like, it always existed. Humans have always had agency in one form or another. So what happens in this juncture of 18th, 19th centuries? Then people start turning to this idea of nation and this ethnos for the support, um, to kind of ground themselves and anchor themselves in this such an uncertain world. And if we look, of course, at the 18th century, we see, I think, two phenomena that kind of amplifies this Kierkegaardian angst. And the first one is, of course, secularization. So as enlightenment comes, reason comes, the church, of course, still powerful, but it kind of goes into the background. And of course, church is one of those institutions that limit the frame of reference per people and kind of guide people and minimize their choices. So basically, you read the Bible and then the God tells you what to do, how to live your lives. Hence, you don't have to make all the decisions yourself. So maybe it reduces the angst, that innate angst that you should be feeling. But of course, as secularization comes around, and at the same time, industrial revolution is happening. So that means rapid modernization. People are uprooted from their village settings. They're moving to cities. Their mode of labor is changing. The labor relations are changing, so that's like a time of rapid progress and change that's also uprooting people and also amplifying their angst. So I think it's quite natural that people started looking for or for greater affinity to other frameworks of how to kind of find some sort of community, find some sort of point of reference that would kind of make the world more secure or would make a world more comprehensible. And I would make an argument that one of those frames was national identity and nation. That some group of people, just by mere merit of being born in a certain place, speaking a certain language, can provide you some sort of support or frame for your worldview. So now, how is national identity formed? And I think the most important takeaway that I had from my study of national identity and nationalism was that national identity is malleable, so it's not fixed. And I think this is very important because, especially, I think in debating world, you are often encountering these examples of nationalism and national identity going wrong, and we have a bunch of those. And then it's kind of a fiat argument to argue against it if you take this view that, well, national identity or nationalism is inherently some sort of fixed system of beliefs, fixed system of attitudes, and that it can't really change. But if you trace back, I think most of the countries' perceptions of themselves, their nation, and their people, you see that they drastically change over time, but also especially in the moments of crisis. So, and crisis can be the regime change, losing a war, famine, whatever it might be, like important breaking moment that forces people, first, of course, the elites, but then others, to reconsider what went wrong with our state and how we imagined it, and maybe how we should change our ways to make it better and more resilient for our next tribe. And of course, in Eastern Europe, I think the last moment that's unequivocally a breaking point constituted a breaking point was, of course, the fall of communism and Soviet Union, and that's when many countries had to reconsider what is their nation about, what is the story that we tell ourselves that kind of brings us all together, um, and how is national identity formed. So the main building block of national identity is, of course, what is called useful history, because you can't really that would be like a very postmodern argument that you can just like reinvent yourself and detach from all the existing frameworks or all the existing history and just create yourself brand new with no baggage of any history of any kind. But of course, it's much easier when you have some sort of historical tradition or some historical moment to which you can refer to and be like, okay, this was some sort of good situation for us. This was a moment where we flourished, some sort of golden age. So every country is kind of trying to invent or to find in their historical lineage this sort of moment. And another great scholar of nationalism and national identity, Anthony Smith, said that this national myth, this national story of useful path, usually has these 5 components. So first, you need a myth of temporal origins. So I know I will use Lithuania as an example. So for example, we have these Baltic tribes. They are hunters and gatherers. They're all peaceful. They reside in this. They reside all over. And then you move into into the second building block, the myth of locational migration. So how all these Baltic tribes kind of aggregated in one place, they moved around, and then they settled in our little Lithuanian piece of land, and then they started living there. And then, of course, you need this some sort of myth of how did we develop and how we became glorious. So kind of how did King Vytautas come around, unite all those bolts, and then started some sort of political formation. So that would be our golden age. And then of course you have then something has to go wrong, because if something would be wrong, then you wouldn't have to reconsider your national identity in the first place. So in Lithuania's case, things started to go south when we do this. We enter this union with Poland. So of course we are this great nation with the first constitution, a democratic constitution in Europe, but we're getting Polonized. Things are starting to get shaky, but then of course the real troubles begin. Then the Commonwealth is partitioned out of existence, and then we are occupied by the Tsarist Russia, then Soviets, then Nazis, then Soviets again. So that's of course our myth of decline. And then of course the regeneration. How do we again become glorious? So that is our post-independence stage. So you can see, and if you compare national histories and national myths of other countries, you will see very, very similar patterns. So why do I choose to combine or kind of create this synergy between national identity and foreign policy? There's a lot of there are a lot of similarities on how conceptually these two concepts are related. So even if you take, and of course, international relations have different schools of thought, and people try to explain all these different political realities that happen on the international stage by using different frameworks. And I think that one of the more prominent frameworks is, of course, the realist school of thought that is basically arguing that international affairs or global order is inherently anarchic, so there's no kind of superior power who can impose laws and force countries to obey them. Hence, every single country is just there for themselves, trying to amplify their personal power and just to survive. Hence, and this argument follows that every single country is acting in their national self-interest. But even this wording, national self-interest, begs a question. What is our national interest? What is and of course, if you take the argument that every country just wants more power, sure, but I think even the linguistic choice of referring to some sort of national interest, meaning that there are certain national priorities or national interests um, that specific countries care about, um, begs to answer the question of what are those priorities, and that's kind of relate, and that directly relates to the national identity and how people imagine their role in the world to be and what their goal in the world to be, and that is of course the choice that's made by a community of people. But even if you drift away from the hawkish realist school that I think now is kind of, you can see the change happening, and people more and more acknowledging that realism and power balance and power politics cannot always explain all the international decisions that countries make. You can look into other useful concepts, such as one of them is identification theory. So, why do people sometimes choose to pursue a certain foreign policy, even if it causes them great suffering or if it's not immediately advantageous? And this kind of calls for investigation on why would people make these quote unquote pragmatically not useful choices. And I don't know, the first example that comes to mind is, I don't know, Poland accepting more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees. And of course, it could, I don't think we often question that, because of course there is a common enemy, Russia, some sort of identification because of the similar communist past and Russian imperialism. But then you think about it, well, it doesn't really make sense. Like, why would people? Because if you accept such a large number of people, you of course crowding your, I don't know, social welfare system. The rents for flats are going up in bigger cities, and especially taking into account that, and we can talk about this later, but Poland and Ukraine used to have a very complicated history, so the relations were not always amicable. So then you kind of understand, seeing that, okay, so the Polish people and the Polish government is making some sort of decision that's not inherently beneficial, or it doesn't have this power balance metric. So there is something more. There's something about the people who agree that certain things are a priority and certain things are not. And of course, Poland, the hypocrisy argument can also be made because, of course, Poland had a lot of problems taking people who taking migrants who are not or refugees who are not of European descent, but then they have no problem of accepting more than 1 million of Ukrainian refugees. So this dynamic is also is also significant, and also kind of invites us to explore why there is certain preference, why this sort of decision is being made. And of course, just referring back to my previous observation that national identity is inherently defined for this relation with the other. So what are we not? And this concept of the other helps us to define ourselves. And of course, the contact and connection with the other is the basis of foreign policy. So I think conceptually, these two concepts are very much intertwined. Okay. One of the first case studies that I want to discuss is Poland, as you probably can assume from me going on a little rant about Poland before. So I think Poland had the most interesting, or that's a big word, but very interesting transformation in terms of their national identity. So when Poland got back their republic after World War One, it called itself the Second Republic. Now Poland is on the third republic after the fall of communism. So they branded themselves as a Second Republic. And the question, of course, then arises: when did the First Republic happen? And the Polish First Republic was perceived to be Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that Lithuania and Poland created together in 1569. So, and this is significant because if you name your new well, at the beginning it was democratic, your new democratic government as a Second Republic, it inherently establishes this genealogy, meaning that your point of reference is this Commonwealth that you had or 300 years ago. So Polish national identity in the interwar period was very much based on this national myth of Poland being the direct successor of the Commonwealth. And of course, the Polish borders during the interwar years resembled nothing of the Commonwealth's territory, because of course, Commonwealth was larger. It incorporated, of course, Lithuania, then Belarus and Ukraine. So how did Poland think about these people or these territories that now felt out of their national borders? And Poles had a very interesting perception. So they basically said that these territories, what they named Kresy, so kind of eastern borderlands, were inherently Polish, and they thought that all these masses of people should be brought or incorporated into into Poland. And so and Poland always perceived itself to be this unique Christian nation that has this unique mission of bringing these lands together, holding all this territory together in the spirit of the Commonwealth. So basically, Poland had very much imperialist claims. And of course, if you know anything about Lithuanian history, that they actually acted on this perception that they belong in those territories that before they're the part of the Commonwealth by taking Vilnius in 1920s. And of course, the Ukrainian, the western part of modern day Ukraine was also very much under the influence of Polish constant attempts to kind of exert power and so forth. So this doesn't seem very promising because also the arguments have been made that because Poland was so set on restoring the Commonwealth and denying the right of statehood for other Eastern European countries. That's why, for example, the Baltics and Poland did not have any security guarantees or some sort of security cooperation leading up to the Second World War. And that's, of course, limited our ability to resist all those invasions that happened during World War II. So it had like very much practical effects in terms of how these Eastern European countries interacted with each other and how we cooperated with each other. So then, of course, World War II happens, the times of troubles, and all this Kresy region, including Poland, all under communism. And you might be interested, what happens to this Polish idea that it's predestined to unite the masses of people of the Commonwealth and these imperial aspirations to take back, I don't know, Vilnius region, Lviv in Ukraine, Volhynia region in Ukraine. So, and actually, a very interesting thing happens. So here at the bottom left, you can see this publication, Cultura, and the guy or the man who was responsible for its publication, Giedroyc. So this Cultura, this publication, was Polish emigre project. So all the intellectuals who fled Poland to France, and they lived in, well, even though it says that Cultura was published in Paris, well, all these intellectuals lived in the Paris suburbia because we could not afford to live in an expensive city like Paris. But then they would get together and they started thinking. So this conversation is happening in the starting early 60s and then continuing on. They start to think, okay, so our second republic wasn't too great. Like, we were not resilient. We got conquered easily. Our relations with our neighbors were horrendous. So something was fundamentally wrong. So let's start to think, just in case some point in history the opportunity emerges for us to have another state, third republic, how it should be fundamentally different, how we the Poles should think about ourselves so that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. So the people writing for Cultura, they made, I think, by far the most important argument, starting from the 60s, being developed all the way to the 1980s, is that Poland has to drop its perceived exceptionalism and its perceived role as the inheritor of Commonwealth. So basically, it has to drop all the territorial claims for other republics that were now a part of the Soviet Union, so explicitly Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, and basically support those countries' struggle for independence. So instead of interfighting, the choice was made to work together for the common goal, meaning all countries getting independence. And then Cultura editors also talked a lot about the need for Poland to brand itself as a Central European country. So basically, not the country that has some sort of civilizing mission, not this country that's exporting, I know, civilization, but just a country that's placed here on the map, and because of its position on the map, how it can kind of balance between Germany and Russia, and how it can kind of achieve some sort of normalization with these two countries, while at the same time maintaining good relations with its neighbors. And so these intellectual debates that are happening in Paris in the, I don't know, Khrushchev, Brezhnev era, way before Gorbachev, way before any kind of democratization was starting to happen in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. These arguments, of course, and these discussions, of course, trickle down to mainland Poland. So leaders of Solidarity, read Cultura. That was like the most popular samizdat, or illegal publications, underground publications that people read. And then, of course, when you see this democratic movement starting to emerge in 1980s in Poland, you can see that their leaders are embracing these beliefs, these arguments that were made by these emigre intellectuals in the 60s and 70s. And the true indication that this was happening and that these ideas were trickling down to people who were in Poland actually at the time starting to shake up the political system was this occurrence in 1989. And this relates to our beloved Lithuania. So late 1980s, right? So Sąjūdis is happening while in Lithuania, so there is some sort of independence movement brewing. And while at the same time in Poland, Solidarity has won seats in their Sejm, and there is this the independence is much more certain for Poland than it is for Lithuania or any other Soviet republics. And of course, as we know, Lithuania's largest ethnic minority is Polish. Well, now it might be changing with the recent developments, but historically has always been our greatest national minority has always been Polish. And in that time, of course, because there was this rise of Lithuanian nationalism or this Lithuanian national identity. So one of the main Sąjūdis claims was the establishment of Lithuanian language as the official language of Lithuania. It was before then they started making claims about independence. But so ethnic minorities were supposedly scared about this rise of Lithuanian nationalism in the wake of Sąjūdis. And of course, this is not a uniform phenomenon. So there have been thousands and thousands of people who were Polish or Russian speakers and who supported Sąjūdis and supported Lithuania's independence movement. But of course, Moscow tried to exploit these inherent cleavages or these inherent worries that ethnic minorities had in Lithuania. So we propped up this organization called Jedinstvo, and this organization was kind of the main opposition movement to Sąjūdis, and they carried out, I don't know, protest against the Sąjūdis and against all these independence claims, and in this framework of Jedinstvo, this organization, in 1989, the Polish minority of Vilnius region starts making claims that they want autonomy. So basically, that they want to have this autonomous region. I think in the middle map you can see it's marked in the red, where Poland should have this special status, and this special autonomous region should be supported by mainland Poland because it's mostly predominantly Polish speakers are living in that region. So as you can see, it's basically all the Vilnius district except maybe Vilnius city. And then you think about late 80s and early 90s. So Lithuania was definitely not in the position to fight against, I don't know, let's say Polish army coming in and helping their Polish speakers, because of course Lithuania was already trying to establish itself, its independence from Moscow, so it could definitely could not have fought a battle on two fronts. You see, like, it would have been a very easy grab for Poland because you have supposedly this organic desire for people to have autonomy within Lithuania. You have Polish speakers there, when you have a massive uncertainty in the country. But Solidarity, and Lech Walesa, who was the leader at the time, actively makes a choice not to intervene and not to support the Polish, supposedly organic Polish claims for independence. And I was in the archives last winter, and I saw this letter written by Lech Walesa, the leader of Solidarity, to Steigiamasis Sąjūdis. And basically he says that yes, ensuring rights for ethnic minorities is important, as it is in Poland, as it is in Lithuania. But he basically says that Poland has no interest in territorial grabs of its previous Commonwealth territories, and it basically chooses not to not to support this intervention. And that and at that point, of course, the movement for autonomy kind of dies out because there is now no support from mainland Poland, because it kind of rejected this imperialist national identity. And of course, Moscow single-handedly cannot intervene on the behalf of Poles in Lithuania. And this is the critical moment, because if you think about it, if Poland had not made this decision, firstly in 60s, 70s in this emigre intellectual circles, later on in mainland Poland with solidarity leaders, if it would not have made this choice of dropping these imperialist Commonwealth historical exceptionalism claims and would have intervened in Lithuania, then our prospects, both Polish and Lithuanian, and I think for the rest of Baltics, the argument stands, but our prospects of joining NATO and the EU have been so early on as we did, would not have been existent. Because as we can see now with Ukraine, if a country is involved in any sort of conflict and there's some sort of unrest between certain countries, well, then candidacy and getting into these organizations becomes very much uncertain. So you can kind of see how this Polish intellectual idea of the seismic shift of how the country should perceive itself directly trickles down at how it leads itself in its own democratic movement, and then how it leads itself with its neighboring countries and what kind of relationships it establishes. So I think this is one of the most pivotal moments that explains how events in early 90s happened the way they happened. And I think this intellectual, cultural understanding was truly the crux of it. And then the last case that I want to talk about kind of briefly is Belarus. Because I just been following the news recently, and I see that this question of Litvinism is now on the rise. So Litvinism is this concept of, or people call it a branch of nationalism in Belarus, that basically emphasizes Belarus' historical role in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, LDK. And it would be hard to make an argument that Belarus was not a part of that state, even though it's a medieval state, and Belarus, as we know it now, did not exist at the time. But the peoples we call Ruthenian were actively involved, and were one of the main comprising groups of the Grand Duchy, and all the Grand Duchy statues are written in Ruthenian language. And even though there's a huge historical debate about the origins of Ruthenian language, I think it's safe to claim that it's the closest language to Ruthenian is now Belarusian. So you can definitely clearly see the historical role of Belarus in the political formation and political life of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And if you see, so here at the bottom on the left, you can see the flag that is now used by the Belarusian democratic opposition. And I bet you have seen this flag all over Vilnius and during 2020 protests. I think what is striking is that right in the middle, we see Vitas. We see Lithuanian coat of arms that is now used, that is basically the same for Belarus. And that this is the historical legacy that the Belarusian political opposition is kind of tapping into to make this argument that Belarus is a European, kind of to distance itself from Russia and this Lukashenko's project of being in this close relation with Moscow. So he kind of tried to distance himself by drawing from this historical tradition of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, of its common state of Lithuania, and kind of using the similar symbols to establish itself on the political arena as the European nation, as a democratic European force. And if you look at the top, you can see what is the official flag of Belarus today. So on the further right, you can see the flag of the Belarus Soviet Republic. And then on the left, you can see the modern day official Belarusian flag. So you can say they didn't really do much of their rebranding. They just removed hammer and sickle, but it's basically the same. So you can kind of see that that Lukashenko's current imagining of the nation is really much tied with the history of Soviet history. So Lukashenko once said that Lenin is the founder of the Belarusian state. That's why Belarusians are forever indebted to this communist tradition and communist revolutionaries for basically giving them statehood. And of course, the narrative of Great Patriotic War, World War II, is very pertinent. So we have May 1st parades in May to commemorate the supposed great victory. So you can kind of see how Lukashenko is picking a historical tradition and kind of the underlying narratives for national identity also strategically to kind of make itself more aligned with Russia. But of course, it's important to say that Lukashenko also had this very unstable or kind of shifting views on Belarusian national identity, because I think in since 2005, from on and off, from time to time, Lukashenko would kind of look favorably into the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, especially when really his relationship with Moscow would go south, especially over gas. So whenever Moscow tried to increase the price gases for Lukashenko, and Belarus has been historically receiving Russian gas at a massive discount. So these are not market prices. Basically, Russia has been giving them for to Belarus for a very symbolic fee. So whenever Russia would try to increase the price of gases at least slightly, Lukashenko would kind of rebel. And one tools of rebellion that he would utilize would be, of course, this collective history. So from time to time, he would do some work on medieval Grand Duchy castles, saying like, "Oh, look, we have these in our territory," meaning we also share this history. Or he would rename some streets after some dukes. But of course, then it was useful, or then it was used to kind of leverage against Moscow. But for the most part, Lukashenko has been very much consistently trying to distance himself from the Commonwealth past, from the Grand Duchy past, and kind of side of the Soviet memory. But interestingly, the opposition movement in Belarus now, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the president-elect in exile living in Lithuania, she and her team are thoroughly using and grounding their political agenda in this idea of Litvinism and this idea of the shared Belarusian history with Lithuania. And for example, if you explore how Tikhanovskaya's political agenda, you can see that Tikhanovskaya is way more active about making arguments of why Belarus should be, of course, democratic Belarus should be a member of the European Union. And that argument kind of stems from the idea that Belarus was once the same country as Lithuania, and they have this shared legacy. Hence, Belarus is a democratic and European nation and has that potential in of itself. Hence, it should be a part of the European community. while Tikhanovska's team they're way more reserved about making any sort of arguments about NATO. So that's an interesting observation, and that also has its grounds in national identity. But also, I think even for Lithuania, it's a very interesting case because now I think for the past month there has been this discussion, I think in Seimas and even in the media, is how maybe Litvinism is causing some national security threat to Lithuania, because of course, as every branch of I'm not sure if I can call this ideology, but um, any um, any kind of aspect of nationalism can happen. It can happen that it sometimes goes to a more radical side, and then there has been instances where some people made outlandish claims that actually Grand Duchy of Lithuania was not a Lithuanian state, but Belarusian state, and that Lithuanians didn't even exist at that time. So there have been some instances of like very marginal, very not prominent at all. But it's kind of interesting that Lithuania is now picking up on these like very marginal instances and trying to kind of investigate them, and even make a I don't know explore if Litvinism and Belarusian national identity, the democratic Belarusian identity, is somehow posing threat to Lithuania. And of course, I think that's also an interesting phenomenon for Lithuania, because it clearly shows our own insecurities and our own inability to share our own history, because Grand Duchy is our golden age, so God forbid we have to share it with anyone else. But as we can see, this history of Grand Duchy and Belarus' historical role in Europe, that is distinct from its history with Russia, and is very much important for Belarusian independence movement, for Belarusian democratic movement. And I think this is a very important conceptual understanding that both Lithuania needs to kind of internalize and celebrate instead of fearmonger again. And I think it's also important for Belarus and its democratic forces to kind of draw from some sort of historical tradition that would be very much favorable to them and to their democratic efforts. Okay, I'm sorry, I've been talking for a very long time. Please, I know probably, I hope you're not too bored, but if you have any questions, please, whatever the procedure is, either just jump in. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be a question. Maybe you have some sort of observation, or you don't agree with something, or you have some interesting observations that been happening in the region lately. We can surely discuss that. Um,
Nobody seems to be raising their hands.
mm, yeah. So, and if anything else comes up, and if you have some, I don't know, ideas or questions afterwards, please feel free to, I don't know, message me on Facebook. I am usually pretty responsive, so we can have a discussion there. But yeah, but thank you so much for listening to my little hectic rant. I hope it was useful in some way or form. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone who has tuned in.
Thanks for your workshop, Vita. Thanks to the audience. The recording will be posted shortly.